Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore the theme of travel and traveling, which was suggested by a viewer who goes by the name of Henry Lopka. I think that's how you might pronounce that name. I also appreciate the very thoughtful and articulate way he poses the question. He writes, "I'd like to hear your opinion on the value or importance of travel. If you ask someone what they would do with $1 million, most people might reply, travel. But why? What are they hoping to find? Some might say that they're trying to find themselves, but is that the only way you can find yourself? Often I wonder if people would travel at all if they couldn't brag about it on social media with posts, videos, or pictures. If people travel to escape from their life, what does that say about their life or where it's going?" There are several ways to answer this question, and I'm curious to hear what your answer would be. So, a tip of the invisible cap to you, Henry Lopka, for that cool idea. Anyhow, here's the usual roadmap of the material in this video, and also as usual you can find the same roadmap in the description section of this video along with links to the timestamps. Anyhow, like I was saying, this video is about travel, especially with respect to the question of what we're hoping to find. I'd first like to explore travel in its usual conventional sense, that is, the kind of traveling that involves moving from one geographical location to another one. Then I'd like to explore travel in a somewhat more figurative sense, traveling with respect to the more internal terrain of our subjectivity. Basically, traveling toward the within rather than over the geographical world. But let's look at travel in its more literal and conventional sense first. Of course, sometimes we do that kind of traveling out of pure practical necessity, like when our work requires it, or when we want to visit someone who happens to live far away. Of course, at other times, traveling isn't quite so thoroughly governed by pure pragmatism, but it's still mostly a means to some other end, such as when we travel to go skiing or to relax on a sunny beach somewhere. And at still other times, travel takes the form of something like tourism, where the point is to see amazing sights or to experience a different locale or culture. And at this point, I'd like to reiterate Henry Lopka's excellent question, which is, what are we really looking for, especially in that last and least pragmatic form of traveling? Of course, as is the case with many other complex human phenomena, our underlying motivations for traveling can certainly vary a lot from person to person, and even from one point in our lives to another. And furthermore, a lot of our motivations for traveling are probably complicated composites of any number of underlying desires and motives. But realizing all of that mostly just defers the question, which then becomes, okay, but what are some of the main ones? And to organize and make sense of some of the possible answers to that question, I'd like to make use of a distinction that comes to us from the psychologist Abraham Maslow, and it involves distinguishing between what he calls deficiency motivations and being motivations. Basically, our deficiency motivations are about trying to obtain whatever seems to be missing in our lives. For instance, if our main motivation for going to work is mostly about being paid, especially if we feel like we wouldn't have enough money otherwise, well, that's a deficiency motivation because it's governed mostly by a perceived deficiency of money. And if we're honest about it, probably a lot of our motivations in this life are like that. After all, a lot of the time we're just trying to get what we want, what we desire. And we don't desire what we already have because we already have it. But on the other hand, when we've more or less satisfied the various deficiencies in our lives, both physical and psychological, then according to Maslow, our motivations naturally shift toward fulfilling our very existence itself. That is, toward actualizing our deepest possibilities and potentials. For Maslow, these are our being motivations, and all of our lower order deficiency motivations eventually lead us toward them. In other words, the whole point of trying to obtain what we're lacking is ultimately to arrive at the kind of life that's mostly about consummating and fulfilling our existence itself, and beginning to manifest a kind of powerful destiny as we move from moment to moment. So, what does all of that have to do with traveling? Well, traveling can very easily be mostly about trying to meet our various deficiencies in our lives. For instance, if our main underlying reason for traveling is so that we can brag about it on social media, well, odds are pretty good that we're trying to meet some sort of deficiency motivation. That's first because traveling for that reason would probably be little more than a strategy for gaining a sense of approval or worth or superiority in other people's eyes, which, of course, becomes especially important when we feel like we're not getting a lot of that in our own lives, which, of course, would be a kind of deficiency motivation. However, most of the time when we try to impress other people, what we're really doing is trying to impress ourselves. Basically, we strive to convince other people of our worth so that we can believe in it ourselves. That applies to a lot of things in life, not only travel, but things like displaying our wealth, our status, our power, our talent, our good luck, etc. But here again, it's governed mostly by the logic of deficiency motivation, especially because when we already feel more or less complete and secure in who we are, there's naturally very little need to impress anyone about anything. Of course, sometimes we travel not so much to feel good about ourselves by bragging to other people about it, but simply to feel an interior sense of superiority in our own minds, to think of ourselves as being more experienced or worldly or cosmopolitan, for instance. In that case, we've managed to cut out the middleman, as it were, but it still boils down mostly to an egoistic deficiency motivation because, once again, when we're secure in who we are, there's very little need to impress ourselves or to prove to ourselves that we're worthy, superior, etc. Okay, another example. Sometimes we travel because we feel bored with our current routine and want some kind of break from it. But here once again, it mostly boils down to a deficiency motivation, especially insofar as being bored means that our present situation is lacking excitement or stimulation somehow. But in light of the commonality of these sorts of motivations for traveling, the question then naturally becomes, well, what would the other kind of travel look like? The kind that's motivated mostly by fulfilling our being. And here the answer is a lot harder to articulate. First, because it's a relatively rare phenomenon, but also because describing it requires something other than dull, prosaic language. But despite those difficulties, let's try to conjure a sense for what the kind of traveling that's about fulfilling our existence actually looks like. Let's say that sometimes we travel as a way of, well, as a way of falling more thoroughly in love with life, especially by knowing our world's contours and subtleties more intimately, by taking all of the staggering beauty and pain and history we can see in this world into ourselves, into the inner sanctum of our living, breathing experience. And sometimes, if we're exceptionally lucky, we can feel wildly and brilliantly alive in the process. We can feel liberated, unchained, like we're finally and definitively involved in something inexpressibly immense and beautiful. The exquisite rhapsody that is the beating heart of life itself, thundering like a storm all around us. And so we find ourselves traversing the tortuous byways of this world, and sometimes speaking in foreign tongues and sojourning in strange, obscure places, because deep down inside we know that we're all ultimately wanderers in our souls, and each dusty mile we travel is nothing more than the fulfillment of our deepest human destiny. To be truly, undeniably, and brilliantly alive. But, like I said earlier, being motivations are comparatively rare. However, according to Maslow, the positive side is that all of our lower order deficiency motivations ultimately point us, moment by moment, toward being motivation. And so, when Henry Lopka asks, what are we really hoping to find when we travel? One answer would be, underneath all of our cruder and more superficial reasons for traveling, we're really hoping to find ourselves falling madly, deliriously in love with life, and with our own unique places in its wondrous and terrifying embrace. And I'd say that when we're traveling with the hope of experiencing that kind of love, we're also hoping to find something powerful enough to redeem and counterbalance all of the misery and tedium and grinding imbecility we have to endure in our lives. So I'd say that as we travel, we're also hoping to find a kind of redemption, both for ourselves and for our suffering. But, of course, at the end of the day, that probably doesn't make traveling fundamentally different from anything else in life, including perhaps even watching this video or making this video. Surprise! So in that regard, I'd say that all geographical travel ultimately has a spiritual telos or destination. But of course, that doesn't keep our deficiency motivations from taking over and running the show a lot of the time. But in any case, that brings us to the second realm of travel I mentioned earlier, traveling along the more interior dimension of our consciousness and subjectivity, toward the within, as it were. Personally, I've experienced that sort of traveling mostly by way of my ongoing meditation practice, although my youthful experiments, especially with LSD and psilocybin, also helped me to explore some of that terrain when I was young. Basically, meditation, at least of the sort that I practice, is mostly about learning to inhabit the present moment more fully, and about becoming mindfully aware of what we're actually experiencing in it. In that regard, meditation is about coming to know ourselves much more thoroughly than we would otherwise. And along the way, it's about liberating ourselves from the thrall of our various attachments and cravings and discovering new vistas of human freedom within ourselves. In other words, meditation is about a very personal form of traveling. Traveling with respect to our interiority, as well as how we experience life from moment to moment. And that, in turn, means traveling with respect to our values, our habits, and who we think we are and what we think our lives are about. Of course, meditation is only one of any number of possible ways of doing that. Another great way, in my experience, is through creativity. However, one of the effects I've noticed as I've learned to travel in the realm of subjectivity is that I personally feel very little desire to travel in the more external, conventional way. And so when my fellow professors ask me if I traveled during the summer, I usually answer, "Oh yeah, I traveled quite extensively." And then they say, "Oh really? Where'd you go?" To which I reply, "Well, I went to where I already am." That might be why they don't ask me about my vacations anymore. Anyhow, I mention that little story because it illustrates the idea at the very start of this video. To go is to return. In other words, the whole point of traveling, whether in the literal geographical world or through the more figurative topography of our subjectivity, is to return to our point of origin, which is nothing less than the seething crucible of existence itself, but this time with a newfound awareness and an abiding appreciation for what that really means. In other words, it's all about discovering our autochthony, little by little. Basically about coming home and discovering who and what we really are along the way. Anyhow, that's traveling, at least as I've known it in my life thus far. I hope I answered your question, Henry. But in any case, thanks as always for watching, and of course, as always, take care of your soul. Bye-bye.